Its figures released by Stats South Africa, or Statistics South Africa, shows that GDP increased by 1.2% in the second quarter of 2021. Now, the data shows that contributions to the increase came from the transport, communication and the agricultural industries, as well as the personal services and communication industry. Now, what they also show is that exports contributed positively to GDP in the second quarter. This new data is based on a new established base for South Africa's gross domestic product after the country revised its GDP calculations last month. Now, that small positive growth brought some relief following the recent unemployment data by Stats SA, which reported a record high unemployment rate of 34.4%. Let's unpack these figures, and joining us to help us out is economic analyst and director at Merchant Africa, Advocate Lavan Gopaul. Good to have you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good to be on your show again, Leanne.
So, first, give me your first impression. I mean, I know a lot of economists weren't predicting it to be this high. What were you thinking? Where were your sort of estimates coming in at for growth?
For starters, GDP is a function of the kind of goods and services that happen in an economy. And given some of the problems that we've seen amidst COVID-19 and a slower growth within with the world, but within South Africa in particular, it meant that a number of economists had expected us to grow at a much slower pace. But of course, we saw last year a large knock in terms of GDP growth. So we come off a low base. There was an expectation that we might grow in the order of about 0.7% quarter on quarter. So when we come in at a growth of 1.2%, it starts to show some strength within the economy. A bit of a shocker given the fact that we've seen such a large number of jobs lost. We're sitting at an unemployment rate in the order of 32%. And so considering fewer people in the economy working to show a higher GDP means that we are now working a lot smarter. And of course, that is a function of COVID, as everyone has switched to working online, working at home, probably working longer hours as well.
Yeah, that goes without saying. I mean, I think people don't know where the off button is, I must say. If you are working, you're working extremely long hours in these conditions. But I just want to actually backtrack a little bit, because I suppose this should have been my first question to you. We're seeing that there is a rebasing system, and that South Africa has basically revised how the methodology is used now to compile data, because we heard in the first quarter it was 1.1% growth, but then they revised it down to 1%. And now we're seeing, obviously, where we're at right now. What is the difference between how it's done now and previously?
So the first bit of understanding is I think myself and many of the general public would become very suspicious of statistics if you keep changing the goalpost. And if numbers are revised, particularly during a period of crisis, people are very concerned about whether they can trust the data or not. GDP is a dynamic calculation. And as the economy changes, the method of calculation has to change. So if you imagine in the 1980s, where we were less dependent on IT as a sector in the economy, obviously that would be a smaller feature, and the contribution by other sectors like mining or manufacturing might have been larger. So given the changes that you see in the economy, Stats SA would recalculate GDP to be in line with a global standard. What you see happening in other economies is obviously what we'd like to reflect in our own society. And I think this is a crisper measure of what's happening in the economy today. And you'll find that particularly in 2020, where we had the shock of COVID, and as we said earlier on, many people working from home and working in an online environment, meant that Stats SA had to revise the way the calculation is done. They haven't done it in an arbitrary fashion, so they used a base of 2015 so that you've got some measure of data. And I believe that this is not unusual. It's happened many times in many different types of bits of data that we use, whether it's inflation, etc. And it's often revised to reflect what's happening in society today.
All right. Okay, so that's a better understanding, because it is. I mean, things have changed. Business is not as usual. Things are very, very different to how they were 2 years ago. I can't say this time last year, even though it is, but we have been sort of in this for a while now. But my question to you really is, I mean, this is not good enough, whichever way you look at it. I mean, reporting, even though it is, a small growth, 1.2%, we're not creating jobs. We're not growing the economy fast enough. We're still in big trouble, and we're not even, from what I'm understanding, reflecting what has happened during this particular COVID lockdown and the riots. But we'll get to that in the next answer. Let's just focus on the fact that, what is needed in this economy to grow it?
When you consider the fact that there is an unemployment rate of 32%, that is more a reflection of those people that have given up looking for work. There's a number of people that are unemployed, and the number counts way past the 40% level. So real unemployment lies higher than the 32%. Some of the immediate answers in terms of stimulating jobs would be an injection of investment into the economy. And that investment can take the form of cash coming into this economy, or it can take the approach of an attitude change. So if the administration, if national government were to change, say, tax policies, were to change education policies, and some of it would be to create opportunities in terms of new jobs by way of, let's say, specialized training or specialized skills that people can use to start working immediately or start their own businesses immediately. Those are ways that you will truly kickstart job creation, eradicate some of the unemployment that we've seen, and then deliver real growth. Remember, for the average South African sitting at home watching your show today, they're more interested in the rands and cents in their pocket, and slight changes in some economic data doesn't really affect their financial position.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, these are just numbers to people. But like you say, when those numbers aren't coming into their bank account, they don't really care what grows and what doesn't grow. But we need to obviously tap into the sectors that we see are doing well. And perhaps, that's where we should be looking. And perhaps you can tell us if this is it. I mean, if we look at the 6 out of the 10 industries that are measured, we're seeing that transport, agriculture, personal services, these are the big ones, and mining production also expanding, but manufacturing going down. So, if you were to sort of be the ruler for a day, where would you focus all of our attention? Where do we need to grow more given these numbers in mind?
Certainly because of the style of how business is done now, and because there is such a focus on IT. Obviously, any job creation within that sector would put a spotlight on South Africa. If you look at a number of economies that have shown measured growth, it is those that have switched on to an IT space. It's easier said than done because there is a fair amount of education that needs to happen. But South Africa traditionally being reliant on commodities, mining, manufacturing, and you've seen some changes there in manufacturing purely as a function of COVID and factories shutting down and slowing down during COVID. If we were to slowly switch this economy, I shouldn't say slowly, the faster the better, to be reflective of an IT environment. And you can see shades of this coming through from previous presidential addresses. There was a time the president had spoken about smart cities and really fast-tracking IT. And many people thought that was far too adventurous from national government. But this may be the order of the day.
Yeah, hopefully it is, because that's what we need to see coming through. But if we look back, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, at what we saw unfolding during, obviously this will be reflected in the third quarter, and that of course is this lockdown that we've been in recently. I know there's lots of talk about perhaps moving to level 2. I don't know if that's what the president's going to be doing, but we've been under quite a strict lockdown for a while now. And we saw the riots happening in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal with, monies and the amount of losses into what's been described as the billions. How is that going to hamper growth again, looking to these next numbers?
So certainly to restate this growth that we're talking about is the second quarter, and we don't have the data for the third quarter, which is going to reflect what has happened in KZN and parts of Gauteng. Sadly, this has been a case of almost no transaction activity for a number of days in KZN, a very, very large part of the national economy. Parts of Gauteng have also been on a go slow during this period. You're finding disruptions in the economy that will continue for a period of time. As certain manufacturers have been burnt down and the supply chain changes where the retail outlets that have been burnt out are not demanding the same amount of goods. Certainly that affects everyone from manufacturers to transport operators. And you can see that sinking into the economy quite deeply and having deep-rooted shocks across the different systems. So I'm expecting a dramatic slowdown in GDP for the third quarter in South Africa. The shockwaves of this are likely to come through again with unemployment. And of course, you may see some relief coming through possibly from the Reserve Bank or from the tax policy. But in terms of GDP itself, that'll be an enormous shrinkage. Bear in mind, the second quarter of GDP, which what we've been just discussing, shows something of a slowdown in terms of the finance sector. And that is going to be largely assaulted by what has happened by the looting. You'll find that a number of buildings being lost, a number of assets being lost. So there's large amounts of bad debts for that finance sector or insurance sector. And of course, this means that in general, for all of us, we're poorer. There's going to be less money swishing around the economy directly because of the looting. And there are a number of individuals or corporates that may decide to transfer some of their assets abroad. And these sort of asset swaps have a massive assault on our South African economy. That brain drain and that cash drain hurts what happens on the ground.
Yeah, it certainly does. Interestingly, I was looking at one of the sectors that we saw that was, I think, growing, of course, is agriculture. We always see that is a good sector for us. But I saw this article that's in the Citizen this morning while we were reading the headlines, and it's showing how the Competition Commission's latest essential food pricing monitoring report shows that there has been now a significant drop in the number of farmers. And you don't really want to see that. I mean, they just give an example of dairy farmers, and they say that in South Africa in 2007, there were 3,899 dairy farmers. But at the moment, we've only got 1,053. That's just in the dairy sector. Talk to me about the agricultural sector. I mean, should we be concerned that there are less farmers in this industry, or is it that we're just seeing that there are less but they're bigger as opposed to the small scale farmers?
So a number of different aspects are involved when you analyze the agricultural sector. For a number of reasons, it's become a sector that has become less sexy as people leave rural areas and look for jobs in the urban setting. You're finding on a small scale that there is fewer number of farmers. There's also been a cultural change where certain ethnic groups, Afrikaner group may have been strong in the agricultural sector, and with a number of people emigrating, you have fewer people in South Africa farming at that scale. But there is something that is significant in terms of agricultural science that are being implemented across the country, a number of hydroponics and other smart farming methods that are being introduced that shows you a reduction in terms of the headcount, possibly a large capital investment in the initial stages, but is likely to see larger output. So some of the changes that you've seen in terms of agricultural data showing you a large plus is as a consequence of some of that smart farming and redirecting our focus to higher yields. Unfortunately, as technology sweeps in, things that we've accepted as the norm are no longer. And so the traditional farmer needs to be a smart farmer.
Yeah, well, certainly do. And I think anybody doing business these days needs to be smart. So, Lavan, wrap it up for us. Can we be cautiously optimistic about South Africa's economy, or do we still have a long way to go to start seeing what we need so desperately is that job creation? With growth numbers like this, there's not enough to create jobs.
I believe that you hit the most important point there. Job creation is what solves problems for a number of people, and on an individual basis, people have the funds to take care of their families, to buy their goods and services. It may come in the form of us creating our own jobs, in terms of informal trade, in terms of small services that individuals are able to offer, whether it's carpentry skills or whether it's farming skills, as we were talking about. But it will happen most likely on a job creation level, and it's probably startup businesses and tiny operators that are likely to drive this economy. The ability for us to attract international investment is going to be extremely difficult in light of what has happened during the looting. And of course, if you rewind to the first quarter of 2020, we were already downgraded to junk status before COVID-19 hit this economy. And COVID-19 has been something of a smokescreen just for us to hide some of the weak economic performance that we've had domestically. Job creation by way of startups and smaller businesses, I think, are likely to drag us in the right direction, and that will help drag big business into the plus as well.
All right, Lavan, thank you very much, as always, for talking to us here on the program. Merchant Africa economic analyst and director, advocate Lavan Gopaul, unpacking some of those numbers for us and the GDP data that was released by Stats SA yesterday. Right, that leaves us up to 7 o'clock here on the program, and it's time to get our latest news bulletin. Let me hand you back to Sakina.